again. In this session, I'll be talking about the dimensions of Internet governance, in particular the use and abuse of the Internet. The learning objective is to show that the regulation is not just about what we call hard black letter law, but also will include other mechanisms. And so regulation of the Internet should consider these other modes. And then at the end of it, hopefully be more aware of other modes of regulation of the Internet, other than just the law. In particular, in this presentation, I'll be discussing a proposed roadmap for areas of Internet governance. Now, this proposed roadmap has come about actually way back when I developed this back in 1996, soon after the Internet was made public. It's been tested in the sense that it's gone around. It's also, interestingly enough, been passed. Many of these have been passed in the Virginia law regarding information society and Internet. There in Virginia, the only one that was not being considered was actually intellectual property rights or copyright. And the reason, as I discovered later, was that in the US, copyright is considered a federal issue, not a state-level issue. So in other words, what I'm proposing to you, a roadmap, has been tested not just in terms of a theory there, but also in application. I'm going to work through them, and I'm going to apply the four modes of regulation to these issues here. The roadmap will discuss, first of all, access and service provision, getting online, electronic commerce, transacting on Internet, content regulation, I know a major concern of many people, security, making sure there are no breaches of the network, intellectual property rights, which is copyright in particular, and then privacy. And these have been ranked so that you begin access first of all. This is the most important thing, of course, you must get connected in some way. Then you do transactions, and by dealing with e-commerce issues, you deal with other issues as well. And then ending with privacy, because privacy seems to be a very interesting issue in that yes, many people talk about privacy concerns, but when you're faced with the crunch, many people also are not too worried about privacy. So they are prepared to give up some privacy. So in terms of significance, therefore, I place privacy last. It's an important issue, but in some ways, it seems an issue that people are prepared to kind of let it be in the back burner, and as and when the need arises, then they address it. In contrast, access issues are so important that you must address them regardless. You have to address them, otherwise you cannot get online. So now on access issues, it is a bunch of somewhat technical issues. So the first major one being to manage technical standards in the network environment, so that basically the technicians can get connected in the first case. In other words, you must be able to get the Internet into your country, into your city, into your village, and then after that, how do you ensure that the connections work within systems? So because your countries would have different networks, the telephone lines in particular, so how do you ensure these are actually connected and will work properly? Then of course, at the level of the consumer, the issue of pricing and service quality. In other words, how do you make sure that it's actually available to the mass public? Pricing is a very important issue because if you can lower prices, the evidence has been that you will get more people online. So, for example, Japan and France, until recently, the broadband services were way behind. Korea is way ahead because prices are low. Japan and France are way behind. But when you lower the prices, you could see that there was a big spurt in growth of broadband use. And so they have come up. They have not quite caught up, of course, with Korea, but they've come up in Internet broadband penetration. And then along with pricing, you must look at service quality, because a very easy way to reduce price is to lower service quality. So you want to make sure that the price does not mean lowering of service quality, that somehow service quality is maintained. I've also put under this issue of access to service provision, the issue of responsibilities and liabilities of access and service providers. In other words, your ISPs, what responsibilities do they have, and what may they be held liable for, what may they not be held liable for. The tendency is to think of ISPs as a bottleneck in the traffic cop because they can regulate traffic, but the limits to what they should be, to what extent this kind of liability should be pinned on them. I put this whole bunch of issues there, but these are issues you need to look at and discuss, because they're not straightforward issues to be decided at one sitting. You really need to sit down and discuss, let's say pricing and service quality, for example. To what extent are you prepared to lower prices at the expense of service quality? Because some of this you can give and take, but it's not one fixed answer. On the issue of pricing, and I'll talk about this because this is an important point. it seems that as far as possible, access to the internet should be made competitive to enhance the use, because competition does lower prices. And my own little research in this area using game theory says that you should have at least 3 players. If you have 3 players, then you have real competition. 2 players means you often have what they call a leader and follower situation, so that the prices do drop a little bit, but not as much as if you have 3 players. Of course, you have to be sure that your market is big enough to sustain 3 players. So that's why this whole issue needs to be looked at more carefully. But in general, the idea is that when you want to have competition, you should have at least 3 players. As I mentioned, low pricing increases internet penetration, and broadband use changes the way that people use the internet. In other words, if you were to use just dial-up and I were to use broadband, what I would do is I would tend to leave the broadband on all the time, because it's the way you use it that you can access it very easily. But in case of a dial-up, people use it only every now and then anymore, because the whole process is quite inconvenient. You must dial up and so forth, and the speed is slow. So broadband use changes the way that the consumers would use the internet, and they use a lot more. We're talking, the research shows that we have 4 to almost 10 times more of the internet, even the same amount of time, because of speed and the way that people can do things on the internet. The second issue there on e-commerce, I want to say that it's interesting I think you may find interesting that I'm putting it up here, but with e-commerce, what happens is that when you solve e-commerce issues, you solve a lot of other issues as well that arise. The first major one being that you have to recognize the electronic environment, legally speaking. In other words, the laws must allow the admission of electronic evidence. I think this is now less of an issue compared to in the past, but you still need to look at this issue because in the past, many countries did not allow the admission of electronic evidence. In other words, if you and I agree on a contract on email, in the past at least, I think in some other countries, some countries still may be an issue, that agreement may not be a contract, because the court may not recognize the evidence. So you need to check to be sure that your own laws admit electronic evidence. You need to recognize e-transactions, and some of these issues of like digital signatures and digital certificates need to be looked at. So you want to be sure that your laws are up to date in this area. E-commerce would also mean that you need to encourage electronic payment mechanisms and their use. Somehow the payments mechanism must work online as well. So again, you can see that when you solve this problem, you solve a lot of other issues as well. If you can solve e-payment issues, maybe your government can collect more taxes. Maybe you can make it easier for citizens to transact with the government in some way. So in a way, your revenues might increase. So you can see that e-commerce issues, therefore, you have other knock-on implications. I mentioned that the laws should be recognized electronic evidence. It also means, for example, enforcing online contracts, clarifying responsibilities and liabilities of various parties, how to resolve online disputes. The police should be empowered in some way to enforce the law in e-commerce. When I say empowered, I mean it's the relevant part of it, of course. For example, consumer fraud, if it's an offline offense, it should be an online offense, and there should be some way for police to come in to enforce. Taxation online is a tricky issue. It's beyond the scope of our meeting here to discuss this, our presentation here. But you need to clarify some issues of taxation in e-commerce. Do you collect taxes for goods and services transacted over the internet? And how do you do that? So these issues need to be clarified as well. Now, some application of e-commerce. What e-commerce does is to actually open up new markets. This is seen all over the world, even for developing countries. There are goods and services sold in the developing countries to the developed world, and opens new markets for trade. Those doing artisans, doing native craft, for example. These are goods and services that are sold over the internet. E-commerce, of course, is a 24-hour store. It eliminates the middleman. One benefit of e-commerce that may not be evident is that it actually helps you to automate the business. And what it means is that your business, in a way, you become more modern and efficient because you're forced to automate it. So processes that can be routinized in a business be forced to be routinized because of e-commerce. Of course, e-commerce is not for all businesses. The classic one being for expensive items, that is well known. And then where you see shopping for leisure, where people see shopping is a leisure activity. Certainly in Singapore, we see shopping as leisure activity. So e-commerce is doing all right, but not as much as you might expect. But certainly e-commerce is something that should be tried for many, if not all, businesses. Then we'll move on now and talk about content regulation. Now, content regulation is an important issue to be addressed because some people will not subscribe to the internet because of objectionable content. In other words, if they feel that this content is not good for their family, they will not subscribe. So I know, for example, of some Muslim friends of mine who will not subscribe to the internet at home because of young children, and they don't want them to be exposed to pornography. But there are now ways to block objectionable materials on the internet, and principally these blockings are for children. In other words, the way that the companies reconcile it, what they do is that they will not block content just because someone tells them to, but if it shows that content are not good for children. So pornography is one area. I subscribe to one service whereby the content is filtered so that a lot of pornography material will not be available. And this service I have to pay a little bit extra, but it's meant to block it for children. Now, there's a side issue with that. How do you protect your national interest against what they call foreign undesirable materials? And many of us do have this issue. The USA is probably an outlier in the sense that it's wide open when it comes to freedom of expression. They will allow anti-Jewish materials to go on the websites, even though they themselves personally they would object to it. But for example, France and Germany will not allow Nazi material to be sold online. And in fact, they've raised court cases as well on this point. And their own courts have said that they will not allow materials from, let's say, yahoo.fr to be sold. So Yahoo is trying to go around that. Similarly, in Germany, there are rules against promoting Nazi materials or Nazi history revisionism. And so these sites promoting this kind of content would be blocked. Now, this is an issue that is not easily reconcilable with this freedom of expression. So Nazi materials in Singapore, people would just not pay much attention to that. But in countries where the history of Nazi persecution, these are issues that they will want to look at, and they will block this content. So somehow you need to reconcile these conflicting cultural values. Again, this is something that needs a wider discussion. The issue of blocking content is that of reconciling your local interest versus international interests and values. And it's not just international in the sense of different countries, but also international in the sense that there's a wider community now called the internet community, and the promotion of freedom of expression is great, as you know, on the internet. Now, along with that is the issue of defamation, online defamation. How do you balance your individual's interest and reputation versus a culture? By culture, it's not just in the USA, but also on the internet. The culture of freedom to speak on the internet. How do you balance these two issues? Now, interestingly, in a place like Korea, they have got what we call an online mediation service, whereby they actually try to aim to resolve this online defamation disputes. That may be an item worth looking at. How you look at resolving this defamation that are online. Online defamation arises very easily because when you speak too much, you make some mistakes, you misspeak some things, and so you make a mistake and you offend somebody. How should the court address that? Should you go to the court even at all? And so I thought the Korean example is quite good, that they set up a system whereby you resolve it online first, and then the mediator helps you to resolve it before it goes through the legal process. So that is a way of balancing. That's the Korea's way of balancing this idea of freedom of expression with the individual's interest in protecting his own reputation. An issue that I raise is this: should there be global liability of internet defamation? In other words, if I'm defamed and this material goes online through, let's say, Facebook, should there be some liability? Or should it only be national norms? Or should it be international norms? That's an issue that they're worth thinking about, worth debating. Now, the solution to blocking to this objectionable content is this: that there is no real good solution. The solution is that there's no real good solution, unfortunately. blocking is not the best practice. In other words, if you block the wholesale site, it's not seen as the best practice. Filters do work to some extent, but they're not 100%. Filters mean that you filter out content in some ways. I've given a couple of filters there, filtering companies. There's filters for software at your PC, your computer level, that's one. And then there's one at the server level, a higher level. In Singapore, there's what we call the national level proxy servers. They block about 300 sites, 100 odd sites. Mainly all of them are pornography. You can only block about 100 odd sites at that kind of level because it slows down after that. But there are software filters now sold by commercial companies that are quite effective in blocking pornography in particular. But some content can still pass through, but by and large they will be alright. So in other words, it is now possible to get fairly clean, so-called clean material over the internet using filters, software filters. Now let me move on to the issue of security. The issue of security is this: how do you protect yourself against breaches of security in computer systems? And by breach of security, I include also, for example, crime in the digital environment. You know, how do you feel, whether you feel secure or not? So it's both the network as well as yourself. For security in computer systems and networks, there are software programs again, your firewalls to block breaches. But the second one, how to prevent cybercrime, that's a bit more difficult. Now, cybercrime is a reflection of your offline world. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is the offline version of your online world. Even your spam, where they ask you to go to some countries to collect some money, or say you want lucky draw or something. That's a form of your old scam that out there in the real world. There is no real software solution to this. I mean, there's no software. It's really educating the public. I think as the public become more aware that there's scams going on, the success rate has come down. In fact, I read the report recently to say that these people who commit all this kind of send out all this kind of spam to get people to send them money, they are now collecting a few $100s each time they do this. Whereas in the past, you do read of people collecting millions of dollars, now they're talking about collecting a few $100s. So in other words, the number of victims now has fallen dramatically, and part of this, of course, is education. So here, an obvious answer to security would be to educate the public about the use of the internet, what to watch out for when using the internet. The next issue that I want to address is that of intellectual property rights. And here, a lot of it would require legal inputs. Lawyers would have to come in. Some issues that are highlighted here: how do you acquire to protect and manage rights in the digital environment? How do you prevent piracy? And then how do you extend the current copyright regime to include digital books? Here, on this last point, the extension of copyright is that in the US, they have not extended the life of copyright to life plus 75 years. The life of the owner of copyright plus 75 years after his death. So in this case, you probably need to look at extending the copyright regime in your own country. Probably need to do that. Otherwise, what you would find would be that people begin to pirate your work, and in the US you will be making some money out of that, but in your own country it may not be. So it makes sense to, in a sense, bring it in line with national, international norms. But intellectual property rights is a very tricky issue because too tight the restriction actually is, the evidence seems to be it's not so good for encouraging creative works. But too loose also, you might not encourage creative works because people will feel that their work are being pirated. So for example, if you don't protect the rights of your own musicians, for example, it's possible that piracy will wipe out the music industry, which has almost happened in Nigeria. So you need to somehow balance, this is the issue of balance the two tensions of protecting the authors. At the same time, you want to encourage some level of use so that other authors may come up. The issue of piracy arises in the online world, especially because it is very easy to pirate information. Basically, a right mouse click would lead you to copy, and then you can share the information around. So there's also a culture, so that's one way, but also the culture of sharing this information. Talk at one time was that information wants to be free, but who's gonna pay to create the information then? And then of course technology such as file sharing, it was Napster at the time, now it's BitTorrent, seems to be the trend. You're able to share this information with other people very easily. So at some point, they are working to balance these two issues here. In the US, they're taking action against individuals for downloading music. So they're trying to clamp down and minimize their own losses here. There are some other issues with regards to the copyright regime, and that is that are domain names trademarks? And here your country may need to look at this issue. Are you seeing domain names? For example, can I have a company called .ibm.com, www.ibm.com? And if I cannot, why cannot I? And if your own country, if you have another company with the same name as the international company, should your local company have a dominant over the other foreign company? Or should the other foreign company have dominance over your own company? So suppose you have another company in, let's say, Indonesia Business Machines, also called IBM. Should that be allowed to have ibm.com.id or not? So there are some issues that need to be worked out. You should know that in the USA, actually many academics are in favor of a less tight copyright rules than what is happening now in the USA. They are arguing that in the US, the longer term is not good for innovation because the laws are too tight for copyright. So that's an issue for you to consider as well. Now, enforcement in the US, it is an example of how it is not true that internet cannot be regulated, even for something like content. And the good example that you have out there would be the Sydney Olympics of 2000, where the Olympic Committee actually hired a company called Copyright Control Services to patrol the internet for unauthorized sites that were distributing news about the Olympics. See, the committee had agreed with the broadcasting company, NBC, that they would have exclusive rights for something like $200 million in exchange to make sure that no other site would distribute their content. So in other words, for the contract to continue, the Olympic Committee had to do something about enforcing that clause. And so they hired about 60 people to look around for sites that were disseminating news about the Olympics, particularly the results. You don't want the results to leak out except through the TV channel. So this company, Moscow TV6, they broadcast the results over the internet, but they were forced to stop because they also, in this case, because they also had a live feed. So if they had continued to have the internet being used to broadcast the results, the TV channel then at the time, NBC TV station, would have stopped TV6 from broadcasting. So this has been done since for all Olympic events, including the Winter Olympics, not just Summer Olympics. So in other words, it is not possible to patrol the internet for content, at least for a fixed period, and then in that way you regulate the content. So this is one case where it is actually possible, to show you that it's possible to regulate the internet to some extent. I want to talk also about this final issue here of privacy. Privacy is, like I said, a tricky issue. The OECD and EU in particular, European Union in particular, have been concerned about privacy because of the history. In fact, some research has shown that the 6 million Jews were killed partly because the privacy was invaded. The Germans were able to match the nationalities based on some records. So it is this invasion of privacy that led to this program. So they're very concerned that a similar event might happen. So to avoid this, they are having rather tight what we call data protection rules. So they are trying to regulate the use of personal information by both public and private institutions. Now, in your country, you need to look at this issue carefully because there are different cultural elements involved on privacy, and sometimes it may not work for some countries. So it needs to be looked at carefully. There are two models for privacy. The European Union privacy model looks at privacy as a human right. Okay, look at it using law and in that way regulate privacy. But in the US, privacy is seen as a legal right that can be contracted away. In other words, it's a right, but by agreement you can contract it away. The EU model, however, a human right, you cannot contract away a human right. You cannot say I give up my human right in exchange for some contract, contractual thing, for access to internet, for example. So there are two different, quite different paradigms for how this is to be approached. More recently, because of the issues of terrorism, privacy has been given a back burner. In fact, some privacy advocates have kind of surrendered their position and say that no, I want to be more concerned about the war on terrorism, so I'm prepared to sacrifice my privacy. So to the surprise of some of us, we've been following this. So it's a different perspective of how privacy works. And again, there is certainly a cultural element here. Let me move on and talk about clearly illegal content. This is the easier part, handling issues of regulation. An example I want to give is that of child pornography and consumer fraud. On child pornography and consumer fraud, I've chosen them because these are two areas that are agreed upon internationally. There are not many areas of agreement where it's internationally agreed that these areas are bad, they are criminal offences, something should be done and taken into action. There's been international cooperation for child pornography for many years now. Police have been cooperating with each other. In fact, in 1999, 2002, there were two big operations worldwide involving simultaneous multi-country raids. So this is international cooperation at its best to get rid of child pornography. And some of the follow-on consequences of investigation are still on following that. On consumer fraud, there are what are called joint consumer sweeps by 30 countries that agree to work on this annually, and they do a sweep to check the internet for illegal content with respect to consumer fraud. So you can see there's action being done at that level. Now, what about actions that may not be illegal? Acts that may not be illegal. Examples that I can think of would be like spam, scams, malicious code, and phishing. When I say not illegal, it doesn't mean that they don't cause harm, but what it means is that there may not be a law against that. So in the case of spam, nowadays what happens is spam may come with malicious code whereby they can actually install some software into your computer and in that way get information from you. Similarly, scams, of course, you can have criminal mischief. And then the other harms, cyberbullying, especially of children, cyber stalking. I know in many countries that's not an offense, although now it is an offense in the USA. ID theft, where your identity may be taken online. How do you regulate these things? Can anything be done about such actions and such acts? Well, at one level you can have what we call netiquette, whereby these are norms that are online. The classic one being what we call community-administered sanctions, where you isolate and expel this non-violator. A case of that was a person called Mr. Bungle, who committed some rapes in an online game. Now the thing is that this community expelled Mr. Bungle, but there are limits to what can be done. So it's clearly that it's not for everything. So I think the national laws are needed for these areas that I mentioned. You need national laws for child pornography, for consumer fraud, for spam, for scams and malicious code and phishing, for cyber stalking, and for ID theft. I think you need national laws for this, and I know that for many countries these laws are missing. Then at the international level, you need cooperation on investigating and prosecuting some of these offences. As I mentioned before, there are cooperation already going on. Operation Cathedral for child pornography, and then International Consumer Sweep, annual affair, to arrest consumer fraud. There is some consensus developing on cybercrime. It's not everybody's agreed, but there's an emerging consensus. This is the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. So it lists what are offences that consider cybercrime in Council of Europe. The Council of Europe consists of more than 40 countries. So I think that there is some basis for saying that other countries outside of Europe may agree. At the Internet Governance Forum, there is a group called a Dynamic Coalition to discuss these issues as well. So that's another opportunity to discuss these issues of cybercrime. So to summarize, the policies that should be developed should encourage competitive environment so as to lower prices for the consumer and develop a healthy industry. So what I've given is a roadmap to facilitate this. Then the laws need to be updated to enable e-commerce transactions. So I think that if you can update laws in this area, you solve a lot of other problems regarding the internet. I give example of Evidence Act. It needs to recognize electronic evidence. The Digital Signature Act is probably needed to recognize digital signatures and certificates, and some form of e-Transactions Act to promote e-commerce. And then my third one that the third point to summarize is that you need to empower law enforcement to fight online offenses. So this would be your cyber crime offenses, and the police need to be empowered to do that. On content regulation, you need to regulate content with an eye to solving problems, real problems, and not just because the content has been regulated. In other words, just because it's been regulated offline doesn't mean you should regulate online. You need to think about whether this actually works or not. Okay, because the online world is a bit different. I think the regulation should use international norms as far as possible because the internet is international. So you need to look at how this would be seen in the international community and how it can be enforced or not enforced internationally. I think you should regulate, when you regulate, you should consult industry widely. And industry, you need to consult industry for two good reasons. One is of course to tell them about what they're doing and why they're doing this, but also to be educated about technology and the processes. Because I think that the internet is still evolving in this regard. There's still technologies emerging, and so the regulation should consult industry to understand these emerging technologies. Copyright laws in many countries need to be updated, and so I would recommend you look at that as well. And then on my final point here, to look at privacy regulation. It needs to be considered because the privacy genie is out of the bottle, as I've said. You cannot go back to the days of not having privacy rules in some respect. And privacy, by respecting privacy, you also encourage internet use and e-commerce transactions. Because people are concerned with privacy, and if you ignore privacy, then you're going to have an impact on your internet use and e-commerce transactions.